State officials in Khartoum declare a general strike in response to military coup. The EU suspends funding to WHO programs in DR Congo after recent sexual abuse cases. And the Egyptian Senate passes new law regulating biological resources usage. Hello and welcome. You're watching Africa Live. We're coming to live from Nairobi. I'm Hannah Viviers, and here with the latest in business is Rama.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Here's what's coming up in the next 30 minutes. Egypt and Israel are finalizing the details for the construction of an onshore pipeline to link their respective gas grids. And South Africa has banned the use of imported cement on all government-funded projects. We'll have the details on those stories and lots more coming your way in the course of the hour. For now, let's start with the latest in current affairs with Hannah.
Thank you so much for that, Rama. We'll see you in a bit. Well, our top story, the Sudanese army is facing increasing opposition following a coup on Monday. State officials in Khartoum are vowing disobedience. In a statement posted on social media, ministries and agencies said that they would not step aside or hand over their duties. They declared a general strike, but pledged to continue to supply flour, cooking gas and emergency medical care. The main market, banks and fuel filling stations in Khartoum were still closed on Thursday. Smaller shops were open, but there were long queues for bread. Activists in the country have been mobilizing for mass demonstrations this week. Many protesters are opposed to return to military rule and are demanding that a transition towards civilian rule be put back on track. Well, we're staying with that story and are now joined from London by Edward Thomas, a historian specializing on Sudan. Edward, thank you so much for joining us on Africa Live. Do you think the military government is likely to engage in talks with the ousted civilian leadership?
Well, thanks for inviting me. Well, as you just mentioned, there's been some statements certainly circulating on social media attributed to the civilian elements of the government, which was deposed in the coup a couple of days ago, calling for a return to constitutionality, to a constitutional system, and for the government to end, to release people that it's arrested, and for people to engage in civil disobedience. The civilian, this thing that's circulating, I'm not sure if it's true, but we don't know what's exactly is going on in Sudan at the moment because so many websites are down. But what people are saying is that they want the military to reverse their decisions. They don't seem to be holding out. They don't seem to be rejecting altogether the possibility of working with the military in the future, but they want reversal of these coup decisions and these unconstitutional decisions as a prior step.
So, Edward, from what we're seeing, Sudan is facing increasing international isolation, including financial cuts, which are likely to further worsen the economic crisis in that country. How prepared is the military leadership in dealing with such financial cuts, and how do you foresee them perhaps securing funds?
Well, that's a difficult thing to understand. Sudan has been going through an incredibly tough set of economic reforms. One might call them reckless economic reforms, following the guidance of the international financial institutions who were trying to deal with a very serious economic crisis and prescribed extremely severe, recklessly severe measures that have led the inflation rate in Sudan to reach over 400% annualized in July this year. I don't know what the subsequent figures were, but the inflation is incredibly high, higher than Yemen, higher than Lebanon. It's a very, very difficult situation to be hungry in, and the vast majority of Sudanese people are very, very hungry at the moment. The reason for this is the government is not first of all, the government has reduced subsidies on food without getting the people ready for them, without giving people adequate alternative ways of sourcing food that they can afford. And they've reduced subsidies on food in order to stabilize the currency and stabilize the monetary system. In order to do that, they need to have constant access to foreign exchange. And the reforms, painful and perhaps reckless as they were, did offer the possibility of access to foreign exchange from international financial institutions. Now, I understand that immediately in the days before the coup, the President Burhan met with an American envoy and other envoys. They reportedly told him that, this assistance would be cut off if the transition to civilian rule did not go ahead. And he seems to have ignored that threat. Why did he do that? Well, there's a couple of possible reasons. One is he may have secured some kind of funding from foreign allies that would allow him to take this forward. The obvious candidates are Saudi Arabia, UAE, the Emirates, maybe Israel, although Israel doesn't necessarily offer a lot of money to its allies. All of these people would like to see, are more inclined, more supportive of military rule than of democratic rule in Sudan. However, it's hard to see the Saudis coming up with very much money. I mean, if you look at what the Saudis give to the Yemenis, a country which they've really pulverized over the past few years, they give maybe enough to cover wheat imports for a year or so. It's not a lot of money. It won't compensate for the loss of international resources from the international community. The other thing is, perhaps the military have some reserves of their own, which they will commit to stabilizing prices. That's a story that's going around. Again, I'm speaking to you from London. I'm cut off from events in Sudan, but certainly there are stories coming that prices are a bit more stable in Sudan. That might mean that the military have more control over the markets in basic commodities than was previously thought. So they may have some reserves which they're prepared to spend to give them a honeymoon. But a honeymoon lasts a month. I don't think they would have much more resources to hand that they would be prepared to spend making their compatriots' life easier after that month is over.
Edward, thank you so much for joining us on Africa Live and sharing your insights with us. Edward Thomas, an historian specializing on Sudan. Well, meanwhile, the UN says that Sudan is at a crossroads and urgently needs the international community's support. This follows a move by the World Bank to freeze aid to the country following this week's military takeover. The African Union has also suspended the country from the continental bloc. CGTN's Robert Nagila reports.
Sudan's recent military coup has been criticized by several global leaders. The situation in the country has seen the international community ramp up punitive measures, with the AU suspending the country from the bloc and the World Bank freezing aid into the country.
Some delegations have expressed their concerns as to what is currently happening in Sudan. And while understanding their concerns, we would reiterate the need for the international community and the Security Council more specifically to continue providing its support for the people of Sudan at this very important moment, which is at crossroads, in order to bring together the positions of the different Sudanese parties, civilian or military.
China's urging Sudanese leaders to come to a peaceful dialogue.
China sincerely hopes that all parties of Sudan will act in the interest of the nation and its people and carry out dialogue and consultation that address differences appropriately, maintain political and social stability, continue to promote orderly political transition under the framework of Constitutional Declaration and Juba Peace Agreement. I believe that the Sudanese people have the wisdom and capability to resolve their domestic affairs.
The European Union has threatened to suspend financial support if Sudan's military does not immediately restore civilians to positions of power. Sudan is one of the world's least developed countries. A tripling of bread prices in late 2018 triggered protests that led to Bashir's removal by his own military. Lately, the country has faced shortages of medicines and other essentials, with inflation above 300%. Robert Nagila, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
The Horn of Africa region is in turbulence. Different armed conflicts and political crises continue to rage in different countries in the sub-region, threatening to destabilize it. In the following report, CGTN's Robert Nagila takes a closer look at some of these crises.
When Sudan's military announced early this week that it had dissolved the civilian government and detained Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok and members of his cabinet, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan blamed political infighting as the reason. Since the ouster of former President Omar al-Bashir in 2019, the country has been run by a transitional authority, the Sovereign Council, made up of military and civilian leaders. In September, a coup attempt was foiled, and just recently, General Burhan called for the government to be dissolved. He says he will hand over power to a civilian government after elections in 2023. In neighboring Ethiopia, the government's been embroiled in a conflict with rebels in the country's Tigray region since November 2020. In September last year, the regional administration in Tigray held its own regional elections in defiance of the central government. 2 months later, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed launched a military offensive against Tigrayan forces in response to what he said was an attack on federal troops at an Ethiopian National Defense Forces base. The fightings left thousands dead and over 300,000 people in need of urgent humanitarian assistance. West of Ethiopia, Africa's newest state has been in turmoil for most of the decade. It's been 10 years since South Sudan gained independence after seceding from Sudan. A 2013 power struggle between President Salva Kiir and Vice President Riek Machar led to a civil war that claimed nearly 400,000 lives and displaced 4.3 million people. Following a peace agreement signed in 2018 to end the civil war, the two leaders formed a unity government with elections scheduled for 2022. Robert Nagila, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
On to other news that's making headlines this hour. The European Commission has suspended funding to the World Health Organization's programs in the Democratic Republic of Congo. This follows a sexual abuse scandal in the DRC in which around 83 WHO aid workers were implicated. The European Commission says it expects its partners to have robust safeguarding mechanisms to prevent what it calls such unacceptable incidents. The Commission had been financing 5 WHO programs in the DRC, which totaled over $24 million, including Ebola and COVID-19 operations. The Commission is seeking a WHO reply within 30 days and says that Brussels will then take another 30 days to decide whether to resume payments. Meanwhile, major donors led by the United States and Germany have been demanding fundamental reforms to the WHO's ability to deal with viral outbreaks. Well, for more on that story, we're now joined by CGTN's Giles Gibson, who is in Brussels, and Chris Ochamringa, who is in the DRC's capital, Kinshasa. For us, thank you so much to you both for being on the program. Giles, let's begin with you in Brussels. What more can you tell us about the EU suspending this funding to WHO programs in DR Congo following the sex scandal?
Well, the European Commission here in Brussels has put out a short statement to the Reuters news agency explaining its reasons for suspending these funds, saying that its partners must have robust safeguards to prevent such unacceptable incidents. It's also clarified that this suspension of funds does not affect WHO programs in other countries around the world. Last month, of course, we had this independent report put out showing that more than 80 aid workers, a quarter of them directly employed by the World Health Organization, were involved in sexual coercion and abuse during the 10th Ebola epidemic in the Democratic Republic of Congo. What the European Commission are now saying is that they need to see assurances from the WHO on a series of issues, including compensation for victims and survivors, as well as the WHO changing its hiring processes in the DRC before it can then switch these funds back on again.
Chris, you're in the DRC's capital, Kinshasa. Speak to us about how this suspension of funding could impact various programs in the DRC, including the fight against Ebola and COVID-19.
Well, Hannah, this cut in funds to the DRC will certainly have a negative impact on the operations of the World Health Organization. You know, the DRC has had the healthcare system in this country has been underfunded and understaffed for almost 20 years. And so the country has been relying heavily on the support of international organizations like the World Health Organization. And so the cut in aid by the EU will certainly affect them. But the European Union is just one among many donors who have been contributing to deal with health emergencies in this country. There's the World Bank, the Vaccine Alliance, and other wealthy nations that have been contributing more money. So this decision will not lead to a crisis in this country. The WHO has had some contingency plans, you know, to ensure that the programs that they have started continue in case such an incident happens. Hannah?
Giles, we do know that the EU says that it's giving the WHO that 30 days to reply officially to the suspension. What has the WHO's reaction to the suspension of funding been in the meantime?
Well, we've actually not had a direct response from the World Health Organization's headquarters in Geneva about this suspension of funds by the European Union. Last week, though, they did put out this plan to try to make sure that this sort of sexual abuse scandal is never able to happen again. It outlines all sorts of different measures, including support for victims and survivors of abuse. There's also almost $8 million of extra funds allocated to countries around the world where this sort of thing has been happening. They also say that this scandal will be a catalyst for profound transformation of the World Health Organization's culture. I guess the question still remains is whether those measures are enough for the European Commission to feel that they can turn on the taps again and approve this funding to start flowing back into those WHO programs in the DRC.
Chris, from various reports, even prior to the sex scandal, there has seemed to be a general mistrust toward the UN in general in the DRC. Are you hearing any reaction from Congolese people regarding the EU's suspension of funds to the WHO there? And how has the government of the DRC reacted to this move by the EU?
Well, Hannah, this decision by the EU has drawn mixed reactions. There are some Congolese who say that are very happy about the cut in aid to the DRC because to the World Health Organization's operations, because they're saying that the WHO is a reputable organization that should have had safeguards to ensure that this kind of behavior doesn't happen. The sexual abuse scandal that happened in the East during the 10th Ebola outbreak. But there are other Congolese who are very disappointed. They're saying the EU is punishing an entire country for the transgressions of a few people. They're very disappointed because this country is dealing with a number of health emergencies. There's a meningitis outbreak in the northwest in Chopo province. There's a resurgence of measles, and there's a conflict in the east. All these are draining the national treasury of the DRC. And so they were hoping that, they would be a little bit tolerant and continue bringing the money. The DRC government hasn't issued an official statement. We haven't heard anything from them, but an official who declined to speak publicly told me that they are monitoring the situation. They don't want to make any statement yet, but they know that this decision by the European Commission is temporary. They have given the WHO 30 days to make changes, and I spoke to an official from the WHO, the communication officer, who said that they have put in place some measures to prevent sexual exploitation and abuse, and they're currently training people in the North Kivu province where there's another Ebola outbreak in that area. So they have taken measures, and they hope that the EU lifts this suspension after verifying that they have put in place measures to ensure that this kind of behavior does not happen again. Hannah?
Krista Chamringa in Kinshasa and Giles Gibson speaking to us from Brussels. Thank you so much to you both. Well, United Nations Special Rapporteur has called on the United States and European Union to lift sanctions on Zimbabwe. On her 10-day visit to Zimbabwe, Alina Duan met with government officials, business leaders, civic society groups, and opposition political parties. Zimbabwe has been under Western-imposed sanctions for 2 decades. The government has blamed them for crippling economic recovery and discouraging foreign investment, which has impacted on ordinary citizens.
The application of sanctions against certain individuals and companies of Zimbabwe has been exacerbated enormously by the process of over-compliance, and as a result, they affect human rights enormously for the people in Zimbabwe. I call all countries which impose sanctions, as well as banks and companies of third states, as well as countries where these banks and companies are registered, to behave in accordance with the rule of law. Due diligence principle, lift sanctions, make legislation being corresponding the international law and principles of human rights protection. The discrepancies which exist between all parties, between states, between the government and some sort of opposition leaders and any other institutions, shall be settled on the base of the structural dialogue.
Well, we revisit the issue that we had on our top story with Africa now beginning to see the return of military regimes in a number of countries, which many say is a setback for democracy on the continent. This year alone, there have been 6 coups or attempted coups in Africa, and this is despite international condemnation and the threat of sanctions or actual sanctions that follow such military takeovers. So just why are the sanctions not deterring coups on the continent? CGTN's Deji Badmosi has been finding out.
When the military stroke in Mali sacked the democratically elected government in August last year, not many would have imagined that was going to be the beginning of what now seems to be a wave of military takeovers in Africa. Just over a year after the Mali episode, the military is not only effectively in control in Mali, it is running the affairs of state in Chad, Guinea and Sudan. There are even fears the wave is not about to stop.
I think it is the failure of civilian political leadership, across the continent that gives the fuel on which the military adventurers are using. Then the second one is that the transitional arrangement that is midwifed by ECOWAS and with the support of the international community is such that has in a way benefited the people who should face severe punishment for abrogating the constitutions of their country.
The African Union and regional bodies like ECOWAS have piled on all the political and economic pressure they could muster, just stopping short of military action. But that has not deterred the military regimes. Rather, they seem to be digging in and even truncating the transitional process in their countries.
These organizations, the AU and then the regional economic communities like ECOWAS, they are no longer enjoying the confidence of the people. That is why the Malians are now virtually saying, ECOWAS, you can go, you can't dictate to us, because you did not come to them when the problem was brewing. Imagine Mali government now expelling the ECOWAS representative. It's humiliating.
The African Union has now suspended Sudan from all its activities following the recent military takeover in the country. But the World Bank and the United States have also suspended aid to Sudan.
If we had had this kind of very serious, stringent measures against the other countries in West Africa, perhaps Sudan might not have happened.
It is for the politicians to play by the rules, the Constitution, obey the Constitution, conduct elections that meet international standards, best practices. Once that is up, and then don't trample on the opposition, respect human rights, and provide for the people the basics for governance.
Some of the military regimes have exploited popular support for their action to stay in power and defy threats from the international community. The coups in Mali and Guinea are clear examples. Both have enjoyed popular local support, unlike in Sudan, where demonstrations against the regime are growing by the day.
If they don't succeed in cowing the Sudanese people, I give this present, military regime perhaps a period not less than 3 months before it crumbles. It must, provided that they can keep up the pressure, because that pressure is what is going to determine whether this government in Sudan, the present military government in Sudan, will remain in power beyond 3 months or not.
The situation in Sudan is still very fluid, and for now, it's difficult to tell how it will all end. DG Badimosi, CGTN, Lagos, Nigeria.
Well, still to come on Africa Live. Egyptian Senate passes new law regulating biological resources usage. And Nigeria seeks to change water management system in the country.
Africa is a continent of diversity, with varied climates and enchanting geography, and a people so distinct, but with a shared enduring spirit. We are at the heart of the continent to bring you the untold stories.
Let's have a look.
We celebrate Africa as it shapes its own destiny.
Tunis,
Syria,
Juba, Ethiopia, Tanzania.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Welcome back. You're watching Africa Live. China has welcomed Equatorial Guinea's decision to join the Global Development Initiative, also known as the GDI. In a phone conversation with Equatorial Guinea's President Teodoro Obiang Nguema, China's President Xi Jinping said that China stands ready to work with Equatorial Guinea and other African countries to promote sustainable and common development of developing countries. Here's CGTN's Enoch Sekolia with more details.
Well, the relationship between the People's Republic of China and Equatorial Guinea has been on an upward trajectory, and the two leaders have promised to ensure the trend continues. According to President Xi, China appreciates Equatorial Guinea's support on Taiwan, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and human rights issues. In return, China has promised to support Equatorial Guinea in safeguarding its national sovereignty while exploring a development path that suits its own national realities. China's relationship with the West African country has become more profound during the battle against COVID-19. The global powerhouse has continued to support Equatorial Guinea's vaccination program, donating Chinese vaccine Sinopharm to the African country. At the beginning of the pandemic, China sent medical teams and technical support to Equatorial Guinea and many other African states. This included the provision of personal protective gears. President Teodoro Obiang Nguema lauded China for being a friend of Africa during these challenging times. Indeed, the friendship between China and the African continent has been growing. President Xi says strengthening unity, coordination, and mutual support in safeguarding international fairness and justice as the common interests of developing countries should be a common goal between China and Equatorial Guinea. The West African country has agreed to actively take part in the Belt and Road Initiative and the Global Development Initiative. President Obiang Nguema promised to work with China to boost cooperation in all areas. He said this country, or his country, has always seen China as an important strategic partner and will always abide by the One China policy, support China's stance on issues concerning its core interests, and safeguard multilateralism. Diplomatic ties between China and Equatorial Guinea were established 50 years ago and have been getting better and better over the years. The relationship has seen China support quite a number of development projects in the African country. In 2018, China constructed a regulating reservoir at the Jibloho hydropower plant with an aim of enhancing development in Equatorial Guinea through the provision of clean energy for all, especially in rural areas. Back to you.
Well, Egypt's Senate has been discussing a new draft law that aims to protect nature and the country's biodiversity. The new law would be the first legislation to regulate the usage of biological resources and share their revenues with the state. Here's Adol Mruhi with that report.
This week, Egyptian Environment Minister Yasmin Fuad stood before the Senate to vouch for Egypt's first law to protect biodiversity. Dubbed as access and sharing of biological resources, the legislation aims at regulating all activities that involve the usages of all animals, plants, and microorganisms.
Any law the Senate discusses must involve the members of the cabinet concerned. We are issuing legislation about the depletion of our biological resources and regulate using it. The Ministry of Environment will be the main body to execute this legislation.
The law stipulates the formation of a new government body concerned with observing and licensing the usage of biological resources, including for commercial and research purposes. That is to ensure that such activities would not lead to biological losses or environmental degradation. Revenues from such activities will be shared with the state.
The law fills a legislative gap in the country that led to abusing our natural resources. It has a great impact on our national diversity. Egypt has more than 30,000 living species. Preserving them is our priority.
More than 750 species are endangered in Egypt. Of those, 26 are on the brink of extinction. Senate says the law is a necessary step to enforce a 2013 government decision to join the 2010 Nagoya Protocol. It's an international agreement that aims at sharing the benefits of biological resources while preserving biodiversity of ecosystems. There is still a long way ahead for the legislation to see the light. The Senate's approval only passes the law to the lower house of the parliament, which will in turn discuss the law once again and suggest amendments before putting it to a vote for a final approval. The Access and Sharing of Biological Resources law gives the Egyptian government for the first time the legal foundation to protect its biological resources from depletion. Adel Mahroui, CGTN, Cairo.
Over in West Africa, the Nigerian government is seeking to make significant changes to how water is managed in the country. It wants to take control of all sources of water at a federal level rather than a state tier of government. It's doing so with a bill in Parliament and says that this will not only tackle the significant water requirements of people in Nigeria, but also generate more revenue for the country. But not everyone agrees that is the best approach. Our correspondent, Asema Kende, reports.
Edward Nder, who lives in the Jonja community in Jos, north central Nigeria, is fetching water from a well to store ahead of the incoming dry season. A season of scarcity looms as this well, their only source of water, will soon dry up.
You must have to buy water on a daily basis during dry seasons. There's no place that you will go within the environment of Janta Adamu that you can see water, that you can see you can get access to water just like that. We have pipe-borne water that government used to supply water to peoples, but the water is not enough. At times, once in a week.
Households across the country mainly make use of water from wells, boreholes or pipe-borne, either provided privately or by the state government for a fee. But that has not been sufficient for many poor households who live in rural areas. At the moment, more than 42% of Nigeria's 200 million people lack access to safe water, according to the World Health Organization. Lawmakers are now deliberating on a bill that would transfer the management of water resources from the states to the federal government, which they say will ensure better control and tackle the problem. They say the federal government will then build infrastructure across the states evenly and also commercialize water provision that can generate a revenue of up to $70 million yearly.
It is the right of every Nigerian as a citizen to have access to clean water. It is not a favor by the government to provide water. It is the right of the citizen to provide water. If only 40-something% of the people have water, therefore the government have failed.
But non-governmental organizations like Taste Nigeria are advocating the transfer of the water sources to local government areas, which they say will increase the number of people with regular access to clean water.
If you want to bring something closer to the people, you don't take it to the federal government. The federal government should rather even mandate state or advocate that the water bodies and its use should even be pushed further to the local government where it will get closer to the people.
Some experts also say progress and accountability can be better monitored by those at the local government level. The government says its intentions about the bill are pure and for the good of citizens. It hopes the parliament would deliberate on it and pass it so it becomes law before the end of this year. For now, many Nigerians like Edward Nder will have to do with what they can to cope with the difficult situation, while looking forward to an improvement to the country's water problems. Tassim Akendi, CGTN Jos, Nigeria.
We still have so much for you on this news hour. Here's Rama with the latest in business.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Here's what's coming up in business news. Egypt and Israel finalized details for the construction of an onshore pipeline to link their respective gas grids. And South Africa bans the use of imported cement on all government-funded projects.
It's taken me completely out of my depth, but at the same time it's exciting. It's new, it's different, it's a challenge.
It's really exciting.
Let's start up north. Egypt and Israel are finalizing details on the construction of a new onshore pipeline that will link their respective natural gas grids. It'll also increase Israel's natural gas exports to Egypt by anywhere between 3 to 5 billion cubic meters. Here's Yasser Kim with the details.
The latest $200 million Israeli pipeline is one of 3 planned between both countries. The first is an offshore pipeline already exporting about 6 million cubic meters a year to Egypt from Israel's Leviathan field, and a third subsea pipeline to export a further 10 billion cubic meters per year in the works. The Israeli gas supplies would be re-exported to Europe after liquefaction in Egypt's LNG plants, the only 2 in the East Med and North African region.
The investment required for LNG is a mega investment. Actually, Egypt is in a good position because this 2 LNG facility in Edco and Damietta started in 2005. So they have a lower operating cost compared to build a new one, which take normally between 6 to 7 years. And also these 2 LNG facilities have the capacity to increase. Yes, we can expand. Both LNG facility have the capacity of 17.5 billion cubic meter per year.
Only 7 billion cubic meters are being produced so far, but the North African country has already signed gas import deals with Cyprus and Greece earlier in the year to be liquefied and re-exported to Europe and Asia. These agreements would help supply badly needed natural gas in the markets amidst the global energy crisis.
Egypt now in the center, we're planning to export gas to Europe, we are exporting gas to Africa. Egypt is exporting gas to Jordan and from Jordan to Iraq. Signed about 3 weeks ago agreement with Saudi to have connection with Saudi electricity and the rest of the Gulf country. It's in Egypt's favor. Definitely we have all the ingredients in terms of production, in terms of the infrastructures.
And it doesn't stop here. Lebanon, Gaza Strip and Syria are also preparing to link their grids with the North African country in the near future.
With these projects, Egypt is trying to make optimum use of its huge reserves of natural gas after the latest discoveries in the East Mediterranean to become a future regional energy hub. Yes, Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
Still on matters energy, but this time in West Africa, fuel prices in Ghana have been rising fairly steadily since the start of 2021, and that has stoked concerns among consumers about the toll it's taking on the cost of living. The government over there plans to reduce taxes on petroleum products from November in order to cushion customers, but analysts say a lot more needs to be done. CGTN's Nabil Ahmed Rufai reports from Accra.
Fuel prices have gone up 42% in Ghana since October last year. Motorists say they can no longer keep up.
I now pay almost twice the amount I used to pay to fill my fuel tank. It's difficult to make a profit when I drive this taxi.
The hike in fuel prices is just too much this year. I am unable to even repair my car when it gets faulty because I don't make enough money as a commercial driver due to the high cost of fuel.
The increases in fuel prices are mainly linked to changes on global markets, but it is already feeding through to inflation in other sectors of Ghana's economy. Food prices have begun to shoot up, as well as the cost of goods and services. The government has scrapped some taxes on petroleum products to cushion consumers. It has removed the price stabilization and recovery levy of 16 pesos per litre of petrol and 14 pesos per litre of diesel. While it will take effect from November, some analysts say it is not sustainable.
We are looking at how governments can ensure that the monies that have been recouped from the price stabilization recovery levy for the purposes of buying strategic stock. In the long term, we can be looking at how we can beef up or increase our refining capacity.
Motorists agree a more sustainable way to stabilize the price of fuel is needed. They also want other taxes on petroleum products scrapped. For now, though, they are concerned the price of fuel may reach an all-time high by the end of the year. Nabil Ahmed Rufai, CGTN, Accra, Ghana.
South Africa's Treasury Department has banned the use of imported cement on all government-funded building projects, effective from the 4th of November. Basically, that's next week. The Treasury circular was sent to all government departments. Pietangelo Coppola with the details.
Only South African-produced cement produced with locally sourced raw materials will be allowed for use on public sector construction projects. The Treasury has also stipulated a 100% local content threshold for both common and masonry cements.
We have a huge amount of spare capacity currently in the country. We currently have production for around 20 million tonnes a year, 21 million tonnes, currently producing between 12 and 13 million. So there's a huge amount of spare capacity.
The focus on spare capacity and not on improving efficiency is a concern.
Once again, there's a schizophrenia. One is we want to be globally competitive, but then in the same breath, it's around protecting local industry. Personally, I think it puts up a barrier to FDI. I think it's going to make it a lot less competitive to bring international bidders into this hopefully rejuvenation of infrastructure and development. So yeah, maybe a short-term band-aid on a much bigger problem.
Protecting an industry that has higher costs than that of importers appears to be the main issue.
Well, we have very, very high electricity costs in South Africa, which are probably cheaper there. We have a mining charter, which all the local producers who mine the limestone to make the clinker to make cement, we have to comply with the mining charter. We have to comply with transformation targets. We have to comply with social and labour plans and have to support all the communities in which the cement plants are located. And on top of that, we have to pay carbon tax in South Africa, which the imports don't.
I don't think the solution is to cut off or be punitive in preventing external product services coming in. I think the focus needs to be making South African products and services more globally competitive.
The cement industry has been lobbying government for several years now to get the importing and dumping of cement from foreign countries stopped. They've got their way now, just as South Africa is about to start with those infrastructure projects. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
One final story for you. Tunisia has put together a workshop on the prospects and the challenges of implementing the Continental Free Trade Area. That event seeks to explore the opportunities and risks within the trading bloc. It also did shed light on the importance of the CFTA for the continent's economies.
Experts discussed the significant impact of the AfCFTA agreement on Tunisia at the economic, social and development levels, as well as on trade union action.
The AfCFTA agreement offers several opportunities for Tunisia and its partners, but there are challenges and conditions for its success. States need to upgrade their infrastructure and logistical means on the continent. We need more efficient transport. It's essential for growth in Africa. The financial integration and the banking sector must accompany these projects.
Analysts assert that the African Continental Free Trade Area will facilitate trade in services and goods across the continent and boost exports. However, the North African states' firms need to diversify their industrial production.
Tunisia has no choice but to increase trade with other African countries. Yet, our role should not be limited to trade, broking, or mediation in the large-scale commercial activity. Without a real productive and competitive economy, which creates national wealth and added value, Tunisia's exports will be limited, as we'll only export European goods to Africa instead of producing our own.
The Tunisian Confederation of Industry, Trade and Handicrafts, UTICA, noted that the share of African trade in the global trade does not exceed 5%, with about 16% of intra-African trade. Economists say that promoting intra-African trade is necessary to achieve sustainable economic development.
Tunisia's trade within Africa does not exceed 17%, while it's 69% with Europe and some 40% with Asia. We need to tap into the huge potential in Africa. This is no longer optional. It's vital for the national economy.
According to the Tunisian Labour Union Center for Studies and Documentation, the AfCFTA agreement will set up a legal framework to govern policies related to competition, investment, as well as intellectual property and e-commerce in Africa. Economists assert that the volume of trade between Tunisia and other African countries falls short of expectations, despite the potential of this market. Experts are calling on the new government to provide the necessary conditions for the success of the AfCFTA and other continental agreements. Aden Shawishi, CGTN, Tunis.
We'll leave it there for the time being. I'll be back at the top of the hour. In global business, we'll be going back to look at Sudan, specifically its economy, as sanctions and the threats of sanctions and the cutting off of funding now starts to bite. We'll have the details live from Khartoum and elsewhere at the top of the hour. See you then. For now, back to Hannah.
Thank you so much, Rama. We'll see you then. Let's now take a short break and return your sport news, including Namibia make history with victory over Scotland at the T20 Cricket World Cup.
How would you create your legend?